the greatest estate, our estate, the public estate of America. What we have in our public lands here in this country is very unique. We are the envy of the world with the access and the opportunities that we have in this nation, from mountain biking to rock climbing, from hunting and angling and camping to just being able to escape and experience times of renewal. What we've been given is truly special. When we look at the fact that we have access from shorelines to the most impressive mountain peaks, from desert to deciduous forests and Arctic to tropics, what we have as citizens of this nation is the most impressive and ecologically magnificent estate that the world has ever known. And it's amazing how close we were to losing it all. And I think with the blessing we have, it's alarming sometimes how little that we know about it and how little that we know the history of this estate. So I thought it was time to change that. So welcome to the channel. Join me as we explore everything about all of our public lands. So welcome to the channel. So we're going to start this off by giving you some of the goals of this channel, which is we're going to give you the history of our public estate. We're going to look at who are some of the heroes of conservation. We all know who Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, but there is such a giant suite of individuals such as, William Temple Hornaday and George Perkins Marsh and Captain Moses Harris and Celia Hunter and Ding Darling and Hallie M. Daggett and Guy Bradley and Gifford Pinchot, and this whole magnificent group of individuals that have fantastic stories and left an amazing legacy of which we all have benefited from. And then we're going to look at who are some of the individuals and organizations today that are contributing to conservation. And then, and lastly and most importantly, we're going to give you an in-depth analysis of the piece of legislation that affect our public lands and how you can be an advocate, how you can stand up for this estate that we own. So we have a lot of work to do. Let's dive in. We're going to explore the history of our public lands. We're going to do this over 2 videos, so here starts the first. So to explore our public lands, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning, in which of the 13 colonies, we had landed states and we had unlanded states. And we have to remember the context at this time is that access to land was going to be very, very important to these individuals. They had just come from a nation in which, unless you were of extreme wealth, you had no access and you had no claim to land or wildlife. And so they were very determined to not let that happen here. So what did they do? Well, Maryland threw a giant fuss and said, hey, how come these 7 states are going to have access to land that we don't? And so it was determined that these states would cede their land claims that were west of the original colonies. They would cede their land claims to create the public domain, the first context for our public lands. So we create this public domain. And then through the Land Ordinance Act and the Northwest Land Ordinance Act, we begin to survey and create a process for which land to be sold to private individuals and to be created into states and to fund local governments. And then through a series of war and treaties and purchases, the United States expands and eventually gets to where it covers from coast to coast, with an enormous portion of that being within the public's domain. Now, what took place over the first 100 years in America is we established that there would be land in the public domain, and we established that wildlife also is within the public domain. Though there were still a few, actually quite a few, very crucial elements missing that would need to be changed to get us to where we are today. Which is 1, we were missing a land and wildlife ethic. 2, we were missing an understanding of what man's impact and responsibility was to landscapes and land and wildlife and air and water. And then we we're looking at it in a very naive sense, like the land and the wildlife was this inexhaustible resource. And we see that begin to play out as we look at what happens in the 1800s. And in 1842, an individual named John Gass creates a piece of art that displays this quite well, which was called American Progress. It's by John Gass. I encourage you all to go look at it. And it's this harrowing picture of the railroads and telegraph wires making their way west and kind of pushing out all that was there. And then in 1845 is when we first see come on the scene this expression, manifest destiny. And there was this ideal at this time that progressive thought and progress meant to go out and conquer wild lands and to create civilized space from that which was wild. And no one ever stopped to think and ask the question, do we have a responsibility to these lands? Do we have a responsibility to enact any form of preservation? So they didn't. And over the remainder of the 1800s, or at least the first 3/4 of the 1800s, what we see happen is a series of railroad grants and homestead acts and sales of land out of the public domain gets us to where the prairies have been overgrazed and our stock of wildlife was gone. In fact, in that moment, nearly every current big game animal we have would have been on today's endangered species list. The birds, the mammals, the fish, everything. Every duck, every quail, every game bird was hunted to near extinction. And in that moment, we were very blessed that a few key individuals kind of stepped on the scene and said, you know what, we're not going to allow this to happen. Market hunting had decimated the herds, and what we see is individuals like George Burgonell using the pen and start to challenge these concepts. So in the 3rd quarter of that century, we see a slight shift start to take place. In 1872 was the creation of Yellowstone National Park, our first national park. Then as we move forward a little bit, Grover Cleveland looks at our public domain and sees the public domain really starting to be degraded and realizes maybe some land should be set aside as reserve for the future generations in the American public. And that's what he does. He sets aside more than 20 million acres. Coming after him, we have McKinley, who also sets aside land to stay in reserve. And then comes on the scene the one we all know, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, in that moment, we are very blessed because we also see a few other key parts of this mixed-use doctrine that we have today arrive, which is we had John Muir, who was a strict preservationist and wanted lands to be saved strictly for their intrinsic value. And at the same time, we have Gifford Pinchot, who comes on the scene. And Gifford Pinchot comes from a background, a family that was involved in forestry. And he goes over to Europe and studies forestry and sees these pristinely manicured forests and generally benefiting those of extreme wealth, and compares that to what is still remaining in America and says, why don't we create forest reserves that create the most good for the largest number for the longest period of time? And thus was born our mixed-use doctrine, which is where we hold in trust these portions of the public estate of which are to be managed for both industry and for recreational use and in a sustainable way. So that gets us up to 1900. If you're going to want to see how the rest of this plays out, you're going to have to tune into the next video because we're at the end of this one. But thanks for tuning in. Click below, watch the next video so you see how the story ends. It's magnificent. Thank you very much. Have a great day.